Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's learning session, Promoting Gender Equality in DRC through REDD+ and Community Forestry, organized by WWF Forest and Climate. Thank you all for taking the time to join us. My name is Emmeline Gasparini, and I'm a Program Associate with the Forest and Climate team. And our presenter today is Nathalie Simoneau from WWF-US. She's a Senior Gender Specialist. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar, but yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, those are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once. So feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join by phone. And if you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message through the chat or the questions function, and I'll try to get you sorted out. And questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen. We will answer as many as possible during our allotted time, and after the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional forest and climate resources from WWF, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session. Thank you again for joining us, and with that, we'll get started. Nathalie, take it away.
Thank you, Emmeline, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar. As Emmeline mentioned, I will be talking today about the gender promotion in REDD+, community forestry, and land rights, land tenure rights in the DRC. I will start with a quick introduction on gender issues, forest and climate in the DRC for those who are not too familiar with the country. So DRC has a very large population, over 75 million, and 52% of that population are women and girls. The women ensure up to 75% agricultural production for subsistence economy. So they are a major labor force for agricultural production. Despite laws promoting gender equality, there still remains several obstacles to access, control, and make decisions over natural resources for women in the country. DRC contains 63% of the Congo Basin's rainforests. However, it has one of the highest rates of deforestation. Since 2000, year 2000, 6 to 7 million hectares of forest has been lost. However, it also receives the most funding for REDD+. There's also increasing pressure on forests from shifting agriculture, or shifting cultivation, or slash and burn agriculture, as we call it, and also for charcoal production. The map that you see on the right is the Mine Dombe emissions reduction program location in the DRC. It's a huge area where REDD+ is being piloted, and it's also in the vicinity of the large city of Kinshasa. Next slide, please. So a little more information on gender dimensions of REDD+ and community forestry in the DRC. As I said earlier, the shift in cultivation and charcoal production are very important in the subsistence economy and a large source of income for rural communities, especially women. And there are large gender differentials in land use management, in the collection and the use of forest products, knowledge available, and also agricultural production. Despite the inclusion of gender in a REDD+ national framework strategy and also in forestry, community forestry policies, women in the DRC still face local barriers of access to information, resources, and also access to land and tenure rights. And there are sociocultural inequalities, customs and traditions, taboos, values, and that are different from site to site in the country, but they remain large obstacles for women's participation in any land management, land use management structures that exist. This is why better integration of gender into REDD+ programs and community forestry regulations will be essential and is essential for designing effective and equitable policies and interventions. Next slide, please. So what led to the national workshop that we are talking about today? Over the past few years, the government of DRC has engaged into development of several legislative measures, and the government's commitment into integrating gender into the sectors, sustainable development sectors and conservation has increased, and also with the interest and advocacy from international NGOs, local NGOs, donors in addressing gender and women's empowerment issues has been prominent, has been front and center in the past few years. So with that, more adoption of more laws integrating gender dimensions into the implementation of conservation initiatives and into also policies at the national level has been increasing. So, and with all the work that the partners are doing, the conservation organizations and including WWF, this has created some kind of momentum to that has led to the realization that a national workshop would be important to bring all of these actors together to address the issues, the obstacles, and the challenges that we all face as conservation organizations and as development organizations and as gender-focused organizations in implementing our programs at all levels in the country. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, WWF in trying to work on the ground and at the policy level, also advocacy and policy level on forest and climate and gender issues, is working along the same lines as other organizations, and some of the ideas are here presented here. You will see KFEC here and WWF Forest and Climate. I'll say a few words about KFEC. KFEC is spells out as Central Africa Forest Ecosystem Conservation. It is a USAID-funded initiative of many years that funds environment work in the Congo Basin. So our the third phase of this project is in its fourth year right now, and it is the first phase of all three phases where gender mainstreaming has been required. So for the past almost 5 years, the gender mainstreaming component has been included in the project, and so the type of work that we do is listed here. For example, ensuring women's tenure rights and making sure that these are recognized and taken into account in customary decision-making processes. Strengthening access to land and tenure rights by supporting women's associations. And that's also one way that we have discovered that having official recognition of land ownership by individual women is still not something that is reachable at this point in the DRC. However, through women's associations, we have been able to support official land tenure rights for these associations in some of the landscapes that we work in. Working with ministries also to ensure gender is addressed across land use sectors. Disseminate knowledge about legal texts on gender, community forestry, REDD+, and land tenure, because there's a lack of information flow at the local level, and especially for women who are often removed from access to this information. And we are also working on strengthening the capacities of indigenous peoples and local communities to include gender dimensions in forest and land use decisions. That includes participatory mapping and titling and natural resource management plans, agroforestry and savanna protection initiatives, local community forest committees, support to these committees, and how to actually structure the committees to make them efficient structures, provincial community forestry steering committees also, and working also with women's associations such as CFLED. And I'll talk a little bit more about CFLED in a minute. Next slide, please. So that momentum led, as I said, to the national workshop being held in June of 2016 on addressing gender in REDD+ community forestry and land rights in the DRC. The main organizers of this workshop, who started working on this in the middle of 2015, basically trying to meet with different organizations, involve meetings with the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Women, Family, and Child, and gathering as many actors in gender and conservation as possible to come together and invite them to the workshop and plan for this workshop to happen. It was a 4-day workshop, and so the main organizers were Rights and Resource International, RRI, WWF, and a coalition of women leaders for environment and sustainable development, which is a local NGO. The two ministries heavily involved in this process, and where we received their support, and also who are still very much engaged and committed to this initiative are the Ministry of Environment, Nature Conservation and Sustainable Development, in collaboration with the Ministry of Women, Family and Child. And local authorities are also involved. The financial and technical support from partners that was essential to make that workshop happen, are, to name a few, are from USAID, CARPE, which is also known as KFEC, RRI, the Norwegian government, WWF, AWF, or African Wildlife Foundation, CNRED, CFLED, etc. Next slide, please. So the main objectives of the workshop were to reinforce the capacity and also the knowledge base of all actors working on gender issues in the concept of forest governance, and more specifically in those three themes that we are talking about today: REDD+, community forestry, and land rights. Another objective was to identify guidelines that we could put in a roadmap to lead to the development of an action plan on gender relating to the three themes that we're talking about today. Next slide, please. So this four-day workshop was filled with plenaries, and lots of information was gathered. I'm giving you today just a very brief overview of the outcomes and the highlights of the workshop. Some of them are as follows. So there was discussions on the formation of a gender and community forest management steering committee to take on the work of monitoring and helping to implement the action plan that was that followed the development of the action plan that followed after the workshop. So the main 4 points included in the roadmap for the gender action plan were, number one, the recognition of women's land tenure and forest rights in national strategies and REDD+ pilot projects. 2, the recognition of women's roles in and contribution to traditional forestry customs. Equitable access to resources, including decision-making processes, productive resources, knowledge, and technology. And 4th, the equitable access to funding and benefit sharing for women's entrepreneurship. So these were the basis of the development of the action plan. So many priority activities have been developed around these 4 important points. Another also highlight, there was many discussions on linking Mind-Dombe, REDD+ site and implementation of the project to the roadmap to make sure that gender is very well integrated into this REDD+ initiative. Next slide, please. So there was one very important outcome of this workshop, and it has proven the level of engagement and commitment of the Ministry of Environment to make sure that there is a good integration of women's issues, gender issues, women's empowerment into the community forestry laws and actions. So a memo was published calling on all the government entities for their obligation to protect and promote women's rights in all domains, in all civil society, in political, economic, and social and cultural domains. And this memo also points to the prohibition of the discrimination of women and ensures that their rights are in the establishments of local communities, forest concessions, management structures are taken into account. So this is a major step into the right direction, and it also helps reiterating the laws that are on paper and that are not always taken into account on the ground. So this reinforces this whole mechanism. Next slide, please. So in August of 2016, following the publication of the official memo, or circulaire as they call it in DRC, there were the steering committee met and started working on really developing the priority activities on the action plan, and also making sure that all responsible actors would be working on the implementation of these actions. And also this whole mechanism led to the follow-up workshop, national workshop, in mid-April of this year, in the spring. And this was to help taking stock of what has been happening since the first workshop on gender and REDD+, community forestry and land rights, that happened in June 2016. So the main objectives of this follow-up workshop was to evaluate the work accomplished to date on the action plan, to also revitalize the sub-working group on gender and environment, to effectively monitor the activities of the Ministry of Gender to support the action plan, and to also try to determine some tools for gender integration needed to implement activities in all three themes, and identify priority activities for continued advocacy and support to communities, and to further elaborate and modify the action plan for future activities. Next slide. Some of the highlights of the follow-up national workshop include so 2 full days of discussions on accomplishments at all levels throughout the past year. That included several presentations from a variety of organizations who had taken on the implementation of activities at all levels, from policy to policy work to on-the-ground activities and implementation. So here again, it's impossible to present all the accomplishments and all the great case studies and so on that were presented during the 2-day workshop. But I'm giving you the big lines, basically, of what happened. There was also talks of the development of the action plan for priority activities with responsible actors identified and set deadlines to implement those tasks and those priority activities for each themes and for the sub-working group on gender and environment. And so the report of this second workshop is available, and you will be able to go to the link after the webinar and visit that report if you want. It's in French only at this point. I hope that most of you will be able to go through it and understand the extent of the work that has been done. The last few pages of that report include the table for recommendations and priority activities, and they're very extensive. There's a lot to be done, and it's wonderful to see what is coming in the next year, a year and a half from now. So you might want to go and look at this table in depth, because it's very interesting. All the actions that are planned for all three themes and also for the sub-working group. They also had discussions on the challenges that they have faced in the past year to implement the activities and the recommendations from the first workshop, the roadmap and the action plan. And some of them are listed here. A definite lack of political will of some ministries to address gender issues. So there's still a lot of work to be done on that front. There's also a lack of synergy between ministries to advocate for integration of gender in legal texts and to mobilize the necessary funds and resources once the legal texts are addressed. It's another story to then go beyond that, beyond the paper, the words on paper, and then to mobilize the resources is still a large issue. There's also better collaboration that needs to happen between all actors on the ground. And this national workshop, the two workshops actually that happened, were great examples of coming together, working in collaboration. And this needs to be promoted even more, and more collaboration needs to happen on the ground, because it's easier to work as a group, as a coalition, than to work individually in your own sites. And there was also discussions of formalizing the sub-working group through official recognition, and to also help operationalize the action plan to integrate gender in the targeted processes. Next slide, please. So the way forward, as I explained, the recommendations and actions in the table in the report from the April 2017 workshop is very large and has a lot of information. I am giving you here just one point, one of these actions for each theme and for the sub-working group on gender and environment. But as I said, you can go and visit that that table, look at it and study it, and you'll see how much work is planned for the next year and a half or so. For REDD+, one of the major points or recommendations for priority action is to ensure gender dimensions are well included in all legal texts, and to develop checklists for monitoring gender in all REDD+ programs to ensure that this work is really, the mainstreaming work is really happening. In the community forestry realm, is to finalize and publish all texts also relating to community forestry, taking gender dimensions into account. Land rights, ensuring that the law addresses gender considerations. And for the sub-working group on gender and environment, is to formalize land tenure rights for women and leading to concrete advocacy actions at all levels. So there are many, many more actions and recommendations, and lots of work that is planned for several actors, several organizations, including the government. And so I hope that this this presentation is giving you some insights into all the work that has been done to date to make this a priority in the DRC, and hopefully maybe other countries in the region can take that as an example to work towards really addressing gender issues in those three themes: REDD+, community forestry, and land tenure rights. So with that, the next slide, please. I thank you very much, and I will pass the mic to Emlyn now, and she will tell you what the next steps are. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nathalie. That was a really interesting and informative presentation. Jenny, would you go to the next slide, please? So we can be on our official Q&A section. So we do have some questions that participants have sent in to us. But if you have additional questions that you would like Nathalie to answer, now is the time. Please feel free to send those in through the question function in your toolbar. I have sort of an even higher level question. You mentioned in your closing remarks that you hope that surrounding countries can use the DRC process sort of as an example. Can you think of perhaps one example, and it doesn't have to be, the be-all, end-all of examples, but is there one sort of lesson or takeaway from this process that's been happening in the DRC that you think other countries, either in the region or other countries who are working through their own REDD+ processes, should really take into consideration when they are trying to integrate gender into those conservation areas?
Sure. I think one of the main objectives to be able to get to that point where the DRC has gotten to is to really knock on the doors of all these organizations that are working on these issues, that are trying to work at the nexus of gender and REDD+ and conservation, community forestry, land rights issues. It seems to me and to us working in the DRC that involving different levels of the government and also involving the local organizations, civil society organizations, international NGOs, donors, bringing all of these people together to work on policy issues to make sure that these are addressed at the national level and that they trickle down into through all the levels to the ground is very important, because there is a definite lack of knowledge and information about rights, community rights on land issues, and even more for women's rights on these issues. So it's important that the information flows from the top to the bottom and from the bottom to the top likewise, so that all these processes are well known, and that there is buy-in from the ministries that are involved mainly in those sectors to make sure that it's not just the work of organizations, but it's also a commitment from the government. I think that's these are the main points for success.
Great, thank you. With your experiences on the ground, can you talk a little bit more about some of the barriers to ensuring adequate representation of women in these decision-making processes? I know you mentioned sort of briefly that there can be sociocultural barriers, but can you talk a little bit more about perhaps strategies that were used in this particular instance to overcome those barriers?
Sure. Some of the work that we've done at the WWF at the local level to try to involve women more, their participation, increase their participation, and so on, and also in the REDD+ mechanism, starts really with starting from scratch. So making women know and understand what their rights are, involving both men and women together, having these discussions, so that it's not just a women's affair, but it's also a whole community affair, is very important, so that men also can understand the importance and the contribution of women in the management of natural resources, in forestry issues, and climate issues, and so on. Because they are, as I said earlier, they are the major users of natural resources and forest products, and they have a lot of information and a lot of knowledge to contribute. So they once we have the the whole community understand the value of having women join community development structures and forestry concession structures also. It goes from there. It's a slow process because these are communities that are rooted in traditions and the customs. The customary laws are very strong, and it's not an easy process to, if you want, adapt the cultural minds into letting women access to these structures. However, by providing lots of knowledge and reinforcement in these sectors, and providing women with some leadership skills as well to be able to be active participants of these community structures is also one of the major points to be able to have women in decision-making positions. But again, this doesn't happen overnight. It's a long process, but it's a process that has to happen on a regular basis. You have to visit these communities and talk and discuss and present the information to make sure that they understand the values of having integration of women into all these community structures.
Great, and I have a question here asking if you can talk a little bit more about the outcomes of the workshop impacting specific REDD processes. They're mentioning the revision process of the REDD Plus decree and the national standards. Can you talk a little bit more about any movement that's happened since the workshop on incorporating the recommendations into those two tools in particular?
Yes. My knowledge of all the REDD Plus process is a bit limited. This is not my focus of work. I work more on general community forestry, but I can try to answer that question as much as I can. So in the action plan, there are some recommendations to really make sure that the gender dimensions are included in the legal text of REDD Plus. So with there's another committee also that I didn't mention that is also looking specifically at REDD Plus actions and gender dimensions into REDD Plus actions, and they are also feeding into the rest of the committee that has been set and has been put responsible to oversee the implementation of the action plan. But there is this separate committee that is working on REDD Plus issues and making sure that all of these points are being integrated into legal texts. So if you have a chance to go and look at the table, you will see all these actions that are written into the action plan, and you can have more information as to exactly what these activities are going to be in the coming weeks and months, and what is the deadline to work on those, and also who is involved in working mostly on those REDD Plus and gender issues.
Thank you. This person is asking, sort of beyond policies and institutions, what types of actions can be put in place to build a favorable environment that leads to these sustainable transformations that take gender into consideration? many of the forest landscapes are managed by conservation agencies. So can you talk a little bit more about the role of conservation agencies, perhaps including WWF, in their role in mainstreaming gender in larger practices?
Yes, so I think this question it's a great one. I think there's still several challenges in having gender mainstreamed across the board in the landscapes that we're working in. But I think that the main actions that need to be taken to reach success on that is to work in collaboration with as many actors as possible. So, for example, WWF doesn't work alone in those landscapes. Most of the time, they're very large, and so we have to partner with local NGOs. We have to partner with other international NGOs. We definitely the government is our first and foremost partner in these sites, in these initiatives that we work on. So this is a work in progress, but definitely you have to surround yourself with as many partners as possible to be able to reach a scale, I guess, reach that work at a higher scale, because it's not just the work of an organization like WWF to be able to address these issues, because there are many issues and they're difficult issues to address, and they are also like I said, in these large landscapes. So we need all hands on deck, and we need to partner with as many organizations as possible, and especially also raise the capacity of our government partner to take on the implementation of these initiatives. So.
Great. You've mentioned, obviously one of the focuses of this presentation is ensuring access to land rights. But I have a question here about sort of more specific economic empowerment of women as a tool to empower them to include in, or to participate in these REDD+ processes, and to seek, their land rights, and to be able to advocate for themselves in that space. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the proto steps of women's economic empowerment that can help them participate in these processes and advocate for their own equal access?
Yes, I can also give an example, a concrete example of the economic empowerment that is working well for some of women's associations we're working with in the Mine Dombe REDD+ pilot site, but also in other areas, in other sites on community forestry. So because land tenure rights are still a very big issue, and women as individuals cannot have ownership of land, we have worked tirelessly with district and local authorities. WWF staff in one of these sites has worked alongside the women's associations to gain official recognition and an official paper that gives them the right to land 3 to 5 hectares of land indefinitely to do agroforestry, to plant trees, to use as they wish as an income generating activity and as also like a livelihoods alternative. And so this work actually took place in the past 2 years, and the women were able to access and have that official recognition, and so that nobody can come in and claim that piece of land. It belongs to them. So there's 4 associations, but this work was done with the advocacy of staff from WWF and working with district and local authorities to make that happen. Women on their own would not have been able to do that. I think with the support of an organization like WWF, and also with the realization that women's leadership skills, women's knowledge, and so on can be really well applied when they own something like a piece of land, and they can reap the benefits of this of agriculture that they do and cultivate this piece of land. So that is one success that we have been able to reach, but the first step is to basically meet with the women, understand what their needs are, because we come in sometimes with lots of assumptions of what the community needs, but really these projects often fail because these are not really the right initiatives for the community. So spending time with women and men, and also spending time to improve their understanding and their leadership skills before you jump into economic development initiatives is very important, to make sure that you put the finger right into the thing that the women need and that has the most opportunity to succeed.
Thank you. So you've talked a lot today about how gender equality can benefit REDD+ processes, but I'm wondering if you can also touch on sort of how the achievements in the promotion of gender equality in DRC be sustained through REDD+ processes. So obviously mainstreaming gender into REDD+ has beneficial conservation outcomes, but is there flow in the other direction of increasing gender equality in conservation having positive effects on general gender equality in the country?
Yes, of course. This is a very good point and a very important question. DRC has a very strong cultural. It's a patriarchal society. It's women are not. The work of women is often not valued, and it's a very long progressive work that needs to happen before we see gender equality. We can work towards gender equality. We can work in the process of equity, like equal access to resources, equal access to benefits, and so on, before we reach pure equality of gender equality. It will take a long time. However, we can only keep the momentum going, because this is, with the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, which have many of the goals have a gender aspect to them, and promotion of gender. And there is one goal that is set specifically for gender equality, women's empowerment, and so we're in this new trend, if you want, or this new momentum position where we have to keep going. We can't stop there because the work is not done. It's just starting, and we can see it happening more and more. But it's just at the beginning. So to keep the momentum is to keep the pressure on the governments, to keep the pressure on the decision makers, on the policy makers, and all of these different entities that need to be engaged fully so that we can continue to push this agenda. Yeah, I think that's about it.
That makes sense to me. Sort of stepping back into the more implementation-minded questions, what would you say are the most important indicators a government program would have to have in place to show that indeed gender has or has not been included in a REDD program?
I mean, there are several ways of addressing measuring that depending on the initiative. But I think the one of the ways to measure if you have achieved some kind of gender mainstreaming is to well, first of all, having sex disaggregated data is very important to be able to see the trends in the accomplishments of different activities, but seeing women in leadership positions, in community structures, and not just in terms of participation or a member of an organization, but women in decision-making positions is a good indicator that some leadership has been built and some impact, some of the impact is being seen from the trainings and the knowledge gains and the breaking some of the patterns of gender inequalities. Also, in terms of the benefits that women and men receive from the REDD+ initiatives, for example. If you can have indicators that turn to what is the economic benefits and resource benefits that women and men have been able to gain is a good indicator also of having mainstreaming work well for you, or also of reaching a bit more of an equity in your initiatives.
Fantastic. We have time for just one more question, and I'm not sure if this question is asking for sort of a roadmap, so we can consider it, but they're wondering what are the terms of WWF partnerships with these local women's associations like CFLED. So are they, do you consider yourselves equal partners? Do you consider sort of WWF in a more advisory role while they're in a more implementing role? Can you talk a little bit more about how you work with these local organizations?
Yes, I mean, CFLED is one type of organization that we work with more in partnership, like equal level kind of partnership. They do lots of leadership building of women and work with them to help them recognize their rights and so on. And so they're a good partner to help in some of the maybe areas where WWF is not as well versed in, for example, being a conservation organization. And other associations, like local associations, local organizations that we work with, we often also, they do the groundwork. They motivate, they raise awareness, they do a lot of the knowledge building that is needed for to move forward with these initiatives. So we work in partnership with them, but we are also sort of advisors, and we are there also to help build their capacity, because some of these local organizations have very limited resources and some limited capacity as well. So we are there to also help them technically and also financially. And this is, I mean, definitely depending on the NGO, on the local organization, on we have different setup of work that we do with the way that we partner with these different organizations.
Great. I think you may be getting some contact requests from participants who are wanting to learn a little bit more. But we've also come to the end of our time today. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I want to thank you, Nathalie, for sharing your experience with our community, and to thank the participants for joining us and for sending in your very thoughtful and engaging questions. You'll all receive a follow-up email in a few hours with some additional resources like the ones you see here on this slide, and as well as the link to the report that Nathalie mentioned in her presentation. Next slide, please. If you want to revisit this webinar or share it with colleagues, the recording will be up on the Forest and Climate YouTube channel in about a day or so, basically depending on how long it takes me to edit it. And you can also find the recordings of previous sessions there for additional enrichment. Next slide, please. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you all have a wonderful day.